No, it's really great to hear case studies where people are open and they share their successes, but also what went wrong, what could be improved. And that's really, I think, the spirit of why we're here today. So I would just want to recognize that, that it's great. Okay, my name is Tomomi. I'm a designer. I'm a partner at an independent design studio called AQ. I'm going to talk about multiple design sprints. I'm going to start with a very quick, tiny exercise. Everybody have a pen. If you don't, get your finger. And draw what you think the shape of a design sprint looks like. Just whatever comes to you. Like, what does that shape look like, a design sprint? No, it doesn't look like a slap in the face, but it feels like it sometimes. Okay, so maybe you drew something like this, you know, from Jake Knapp's book. Yeah, I see a lot of people nodding. Maybe it looked like this, which is from the Google website. Maybe you use this one, which is kind of a more older version. It's my personal favorite. But yeah, you probably drew a sequence of steps, right? Probably 5 or 6. And that's our mental model of what a design sprint looks like. That's what it feels like. That's what we live through. That's what we drive towards. But I want to introduce something else when we think of multiple design sprints, because then what's the shape of a multiple design sprint? Does it look like this? Oh my God. Lots of slaps in the face. No, no, it probably doesn't look like this, right? There's running multiple design sprints introduces a lot of flexibility, and we can do lots of different things with it. And it's not just about how do we get through the 5 or 6 steps in like many times, right? There's a lot more to it. And so the first part of my very short talk is I want to propose kind of a typology of the shapes of multiple design sprints. Just based on my own experience, because as I was thinking, and actually having more than one makes things more complicated because we're introducing more elements. And I think it's interesting to think, like classify like the types that you're doing to help us identify why things might go wrong, or like what are the opportunities to do, you know, have more impact. So if we think of just 2 simple axes, when we think of multiple design sprints, I propose there's people. And think of an axis of like same people, same team. It doesn't have to be the same people per se, but belonging to the same team. And then there's versions where they're coming from a different team. And the other axes that I propose is time and space. Maybe we're doing it sequentially, or maybe we're doing things in parallel, or maybe it's happening ad hoc. And that's like basically a design sprint or a workshop, or actually many things in life, I think, is just people going through time and space. And so this is kind of how I like to think about it. And I have kind of a shape for each of the classifications that I'm gonna walk us through. So the little arrow is a design sprint, and the colors represent the variety of challenges that we might tackle. And the big arrows are kind of like the bigger initiatives. So the first one, and I think this is the most common one when we think of multiple design sprints, is, well, I cannot see anything, I'll send here, is when we do multiple design sprints in the context of one initiative. So we do a design sprint, we discover something unlocks, we do another one, and kind of keep going, right? This is the sequential one. It's probably the same people attending the design sprint, and the key use case is to design a specific product or service. Like that's what the team is trying to do. How many of you have done this type? Yeah, quite a few. That's really great. Yeah, so that's the first type. I think there's another type where a team has design sprints as part of their process toolkit. And so the capacity to run a design sprint is embedded in the team. And so whenever, and this team is doing multiple projects, which is why you see three big arrows kind of around the same topic probably, but different projects. And I think they're usually used to kick off projects. So you do a design sprint to launch your project. So that's another type. Another type, this one is a little bit similar. It looks quite similar because you see sprints being run all over the organization. But it's when there is a centralized resource for facilitation. And I think that's part of what Kai was introducing this morning, where there's an internal team at Google or your company, and you can call them to help you facilitate a design sprint. So kind of facilitation as a service. And there's no, one overarching initiative, like each team is doing their own thing. So that's why there are more colors. Another case is when you have separate teams, but the sprint is happening in the same space. I mean, it could be remote, but it's probably in the same room and at the same time. And this usually, I think, happens as part of some kind of program, right? Like maybe it's a training program and you want to upskill 100 students like Remy does to introduce them to the design sprint methodology. You're going to split them up in different tables. They're going to work on different topics, but it's all kind of done in one, in the same space. We see it often also for accelerators, I think, where you have different startups or product teams working on their own challenges, but kind of due to logistical purposes, and also it's just easier. You just get everyone to come in and run the process at the same time. But they're actually like working on their own thing. Another one, and this one looks similar again because you have multiple kind of tables in the room. It's probably very big, but they are all working in the same team. But the challenge is so complex that they work on their own challenge, like one chunk of the challenge, but what we really aim to do is for these connections to emerge, or else there's just too many problems and they can't be working in silos even if they're part of the same team. So something like this, we've run like 70, 80 people sprints, like just get everyone in the room and have these connections emerge, and then like they'll know what to do. They'll know who to talk to. They'll know how their part of the project relates to somebody else's, and that kind of pushes everything forward. This last one is where there's a kind of a core sprint team, and they host standalone sprints. So different topics, as you can see by the different colors, but it's all under the umbrella of like some overarching theme. Usually I think it's for like some kind of transformation initiative. And so the BMP case, I would say, is this one, where there's like a customer experience initiative, right? The idea is to help teams be more customer-centric. So that's kind of the blue. But each team can pick one part of the customer journey or their product to work on. And it's organized, it's facilitated by the one team. I think in this case, it's Cecile's team, to own that initiative. And this one is quite interesting, I think, for all of us, especially if you're working more in the consulting side, because it helps them build their capabilities to do this kind of work. So that's kind of my 6. I have very strong opinions weekly held on what it means to do each of these things. I'm not going to go into it here. There's an afternoon session if you're curious to kind of, I'm going to go to my part 2. So I think there's a lot of, benefits and risks and tips and do's and don'ts for each of these 6 types. And of course, there can be a combination of types, right? Maybe you're going to fuse 2 of them together that are super interesting to think about and share experiences. Or if you want to do something like this, like extend your sprint to more of a program, let's come to my session in the afternoon. But since now I have the honor of having all of your attention, which is really a privilege to be here in front of 80, 70, 80 design sprint masters is really something else. So I actually want to take a bit of a risk and introduce a new concept. It's going to be a hard jump because it's some of my recent thinking, and I think the story is not quite there yet, but I hope that I don't lose everybody. Okay, so in the past few years, I've been thinking that my job actually is a lot of this. It's about creating and holding the space for people to exchange, experiment, and make decisions. This is the role of a facilitator. And then as a designer, we also have tools like research and prototyping and like actually making things tangible to push that along. But actually my value is in being able to create that space, and not just creating it, but also holding it so that people are free to jumpstart creativity. I love this expression from Kai's talk. And so that's kind of what I've been thinking about in the past few years. I think of my work with design sprints kind of in this context. And but recently I've been able to kind of advance this thinking, and a big shout out to my buddy Daniel Stillman, who I met at last year's design sprint conference in San Francisco that Kai organized. There was a one-day masterclass on advanced facilitation. Daniel talks about designing the conversation, and he has this great podcast, if you like this kind of thing, where he invites people from all different fields to express their perspectives about this idea. And there's an episode with another guy named Daniel here, Daniel Mezik, and he's kind of in the agile coaching using open space technology world, but he uses this concept called inviting leadership, and so this really kind of unlocked something in my brain. And I've been thinking I said creating and holding the space, but recently I've been thinking, how are we inviting people into that space? Because we talk sometimes about managing expectations, or how do we manage difficult participants, there's something to be a little bit tricked or controlled. But I would really like to step away from this and be like, if we can create that space, they're not going to be difficult. That whatever's in their mind can be channeled towards a more positive energy that's going to propel the project forward. And so I would like to kind of switch that thinking from what do I do with this problem. So in that journey of exploring this topic, I read this book, The Art of Gathering. If you've had lunch or dinner with me in the past couple of weeks, you will have heard a lot about this because I'm kind of obsessed with this book right now. It's by a lady called Priya Parker. She used to be in conflict resolution, I think, which is a lot harder, I think, than running design sprints. But she starts the book by making the point that we spend our lives gathering. We are gathered here today, right? That was, sorry, weird joke. We're gathered here today. Or if we go to a meeting, this is a gathering. If we meet somebody for drinks or a date or a dinner, or just somebody at the park, we're gathering. She says the first thing to go when a dictator comes into democracy is to ban the right for people to gather. And it's because as humans, the most powerful energy that can come out is when people get together, when they gather. And I thought that's a really beautiful idea. And so there are, a bunch of things in this book where she will go from conflict resolution, from war-torn countries to hosting your dinner party, which is also a gathering. And actually there are a lot of the same principles, not the same actions, obviously, and the stakes are different, but the principles are quite the same. And I think that the work that we do as facilitators has a lot to learn from this. So back to I told you it's a hard jump. I'm going back to sprints now. So yeah, that's my little sprint icon. And this is I asked you to draw a little model in the beginning, right? You drew like the 5 or 6 steps, I think, within that sprint. But actually, what we need to look at is what comes before and after. And in the context of inviting somebody into that space, the Priya Parker has a couple of ideas like on phases on how we can better invite people to that gathering, or like how we can better gather. So there is, even like way before the actual sprint day, when we gather in the workshop, there is this priming activity that happens, right? And I think Pauline mentioned doing the team principles is like a contract. But yeah, the contract actually happens when people are invited and they think about, okay, I'm gonna spend X number of days working on this thing. And so that social contract is drafted the minute you kind of extend that invitation. And it's implicitly agreed, whether or not you say, yes, I agree to be 100% present. And people ask themselves, like, what am I willing to give in return for what I expect to receive? It's like, to put it simply, it's like when you get invited to a party, you're like, well, who else is going to be there? Who do I want to be? Like, you start thinking about this, right? When you hear about the party, even before you show up. So that's priming. And then there is a moment of ushering. So think of like a door, a passageway where people step into that space. It's probably like the first couple of minutes, maybe the first 30 minutes, like that happens as people come into the room. They need to be ushered into the room to set the tone, the intimacy, this sense of permission to engage is also really important for us as facilitators. And so it's not the workshop starts when someone picks up the mic. It's actually starting when people walk into that room. And I really enjoy this idea of being ushered to your seat. Yeah, and then there is the workshop starting. There's a launch, and in the first few moments, we're all kind of checking out what everybody else is doing and asking ourselves, what do I think? Do I belong here? Is it worth my time? And even if you are going to be physically present, for the 5 days or 2 days, like how much of your energy and focus you're going to invest, you're kind of negotiating it in your mind. It's like, oh, maybe I'll go and answer my email in 10 minutes, I'm here, it's fine. And there's actually the spectrum of commitment to engage, and these decisions happen, or we can help launch this in a more cohesive way if we take care of the launching. Then there's also closing, which I won't talk about too much because I'm kind of focused on the invitation right now. But of course, a gathering, so people going through time and space, like it will end. We need to accept that it ends, and we need to help people kind of go back to their outside world, the world that's not the design sprint. And the more different that design sprint is, the more gently they need to go back to like their BNP Paribas environment, right? That gap is quite big, actually, if we've done a good job. And so that closing needs to happen at the end of the workshop. So when I see kind of my version of all the different shapes that multiple sprints can take, what I start to see is like so many invitations that we need to take care of. Not just because there are multiple sprints and we actually need people to come back, but also if you have different populations joining the sprint, like you have somebody new who's joining a second sprint, they need to be onboarded a different way or else we'll lose them. Or a stakeholder who just kind of wanders in, like they need to be invited properly as well. And so that's kind of what I have been thinking about a lot, and as we think of, try to improve our facilitation techniques, and there's a lot of tactics that we can do. There are tools, there are plenty of tips and tricks, but I feel like this idea that we invite people into this space can unlock kind of a more fundamental shift in the way that we approach our work. So I leave you with that, and thank you very much.